When the bells rang for afternoon church, they seemed to ring in the commotion of the puddles as well as in the wind, and they sounded very loud and dismal indeed, and the street looked very dismal indeed, and the house looked dismallest of all. I was reading my prayers near the light, and my fire was growing in the darkening window glass, when, looking up, as I prayed for the fatherless children and widows and all who were desolate and oppressed, I saw the Eye again. It passed in a moment, as it had done before, but this time I was inwardly more convinced that I had seen it. Well, to be sure I had a night that night. Whenever I closed my own eyes, it was to see eyes. Next morning, at an unreasonably, and I should have said, but for that railroad, an impossibly early hour, comes Trottle. As soon as he had told me all about the wells, I told him all about the house. He listened with as great interest and attention as I could possibly wish, until I came to Jabez Jarber, when he cooled in an instant, and became opinionated. "Now, Trottle," I said, pretending not to notice, "when Mr. Jarber comes back this evening, we must all lay our heads together."
"I should hardly think that would be wanted, ma'am. Mr. Jarber's head is surely equal to anything."
Being determined not to notice, I said again that we must all lay our heads together.
"Whatever you order, ma'am, shall be obeyed. Still, it cannot be doubted, I should think, that Mr. Jarber's head is equal, if not superior, to any pressure that can be brought to bear upon it."
This was provoking, and his way, when he came in and out all through the day, of pretending not to see the house to let, was more provoking still. However, being quite resolved not to notice, I gave no sign whatever that I did notice. But when evening came, and he showed in Jarber, and when Jarber wouldn't be helped off with his cloak, and poked his cane into cane chairbacks and china ornaments, and his own eye, in trying to unclasp his brazen lions of himself, which he couldn't do after all, I could have shaken them both. As it was, I only shook the teapot, and made the tea. Jarber had brought from under his cloak a roll of paper, with which he had triumphantly pointed over the way, like the ghost of Hamlet's father appearing to the late Mr. Kemble, and which he had laid on the table. "A discovery?" said I, pointing to it, when he was seated, and had got his teacup. "Don't go, Trottle."
"The first of a series of discoveries," answered Jarber. "Account of a former tenant, compiled from the water rate and medical man."
"Don't go, Trottle," I repeated, for I saw him making imperceptibly to the door.
"Begging your pardon, ma'am, I might be in Mr. Jarber's way."
Jarber looked that he decidedly thought he might be. I relieved myself with a good angry croak, and said, always determined not to notice, "Have the goodness to sit down, if you please, Trottle. I wish you to hear this." Trottle bowed in the stiffest manner, and took the remotest chair he could find. Even that he moved close to the draught from the keyhole of the door.
"Firstly,"
Jarber began, after sipping his tea,
"would my soften—"
"Begin again, Jarber," said I.
"Would you be much surprised if this house to let should turn out to be the property of a relation of your own?"
"I should indeed be very much surprised."
Then it belongs to your first cousin. I learn by the way that he is ill at this time. George Forley.
Then that is a bad beginning. I cannot deny that George Forley stands in the relation of first cousin to me, but I hold no communication with him. George Forley has been a hard, bitter, stony father to a child now dead. George Forley was most implacable and unrelenting to one of his 2 daughters who made a poor marriage. George Forley brought all the weight of his hand to bear as heavily against that crushed thing as he brought it to bear lightly, favouringly, and advantageously upon her sister, who made a rich marriage. I hope that with the measure George Forley meted, it may not be measured out to him again. I will give George Forley no worse wish. I was strong upon the subject, and I could not keep the tears out of my eyes, for that young girl's was a cruel story, and I had dropped many a tear over it before. The house being George Forley's, said I, is almost enough to account for there being a fate upon it, if fate there is. Is there anything about George Forley in those sheets of paper?
Not a word.
I am glad to hear it. Please to read on. Trottle, why don't you come nearer? Why do you sit mortifying yourself in those Arctic regions? Come nearer.
Thank you, ma'am. I am quite near enough to Mr. Jarber.
Jarber rounded his chair to get his back full to my opinionated friend and servant, and beginning to read, tossed the words at him over his, Jabez Jarber's, own ear and shoulder. He read what follows. End of chapter 1. Recording by Ruth Golding.